The Caspian Sea, the $10 trillion void that's swallowing global energy. The rig's helideck looks out over mud. Pumps groan to a stop. A crewman points where the channel used to be and says nothing. 30 meters from the jacket, the sea is a brown skin, cracked like old paint. A barge sits crooked, marooned mid-route, its wake frozen as ridges of silt. Contracts still assume water. Insurance still prices depth. But the Caspian is falling about 7 centimeters a year, and the northern basin is running out of draft. Rigs don't move, pipelines don't float, and $10 trillion in energy bets were written on a surface that's leaving. To understand why, follow the steel. The vanishing sea, measured in steel. Start with a shoreline that won't stay put. Since the mid-2000s, the Caspian has dropped more than 2 meters. That's not a statistic, it's a new map with stakes you can price. What used to be fairway now grows reeds. What used to be safe water now stacks whitecaps when wind piles fetch across shallows turn to pans. Pilots relearn bearings every season as boys sit on sandbars that didn't exist last spring. Ports feel it first. Aktau's approach silts into a chessboard of dredge cuts. Turkmenbashi's berths need constant bite and dump just to hit published drafts. Baku extends its fingers seaward while tug skippers radio sheepish updates. Light load again because the lake fell. Aro ramps hang over water that sits too low to meet them, so trucks back down to groan onto decks, scraping steel. Ferries on the Aktau, Baku line shave payloads to make the tide windows that aren't really tides, just wind set and a lake's long slump. Here's a day you can price and feel. A captain out of Aktau takes crude and condensate in parcels, leaves 10% in shore tanks to clear the shoal at the harbor mouth, and misses his convoy slot by 90 minutes. The queue at Sangachal reshuffles. Demurrage clocks start. A refinery downstream, counting on that feed, slows a unit to match. The penalty clause bites a balance sheet that was already thin. Insurance doesn't like surprises. Underwriters re-rate voyages that depend on draft margins thinner than paperwork suggests. A gale over the steppe can blow 30 centimeters of water down the northern basin in hours. That's the difference between a safe approach and a scrape that bends a prop. Premiums creep. Captains speed less to protect hull and schedule, which means fewer rotations per season. That cost lands in the per-barrel math. Meanwhile, ports throw iron at the retreat, and it still isn't enough. Emergency dredges chew channels through sticky clay and lenses of hard pan. Cutter suction dredges park for months, pipelines snaking ashore to new spoil grounds. Yet the bottom moves, silt slumps back. The work never finishes, it just pauses between storms. Where dredging can't keep up, operators improvise. Barge convoys shuttle kit piece by piece to offshore worksites, swapping to rail when lake windows close. Tankers offload to shore tanks and feed trains headed west. Every mode swap adds hands, losses, and risk. Light water is dangerous water. As salinity edges and temperatures shift, wind fetch turns the northerly shallows into a chop that breaks wrong. A hull designed for steady lake swells meets pyramids of short, steep waves and pounds. Bulwarks creak. Welds get inspected twice as often. Small craft tasked with crew runs or pipeline patrols sit out more days, pushing maintenance windows into nights already cut thin by weather. The numbers tighten at terminals. Draft boards show centimeters nobody used to read. Port masters stack arrivals to exploit narrow periods when a northerly lifts water or a calm lets silt settle. Miss the lift, lose a day. On shore, accountants reforecast cash flows because that day repeats across a quarter and ruins covenant math. Aktau, Turkmenbashi, Baku, they're not just points. They're bets on the Caspian being wet and reasonably predictable. Now engineers extend jetties, lower berths, deepen turning basins, and still lose ground. Kazakhstan pushes dredging at Kurik to keep ROROs honest. Azerbaijan hustles towage and pilots to squeeze more from the same water. Turkmenistan adds capacity on paper and then meets the bottom with the first heavy run. Micro-stories multiply. A feeder master lines up on a channel cut last month, sees ripple lines where soundings promise depth, and calls for a tug to nose him through silt that wasn't on the chart. The tug sucks mud, overheats and radios back, reduced draft or weight. A pipeline spool on a barge misses its weather window, sits on hire for 3 extra days, then transfers to a rail cradle at twice the cost. The crew goes home a week late. Kids wave at a father who missed a school play because the lake fell faster than the schedule. Upstream, river timing adds insult. The Volga's spring pulse, that soft top-up that used to buy the north a season, arrives thinner and earlier. Reservoir managers above Astrakhan juggle hydropower, navigation and flood safety. The sea gets what's left. On the delta, fresh channels go slack. Sand blooms in bends. The entrance bars thicken. Barges scrape. Pilots refuse nighttime transits they used to fly blind with confidence. So operators hedge. They pre-stage inventory and treat every calm day like a holiday. Extra tugs on standby, spare screens for intakes that clog with weed as shorelines go green where blue used to be. They buy amphibious kit, hovercraft for crew, shallow draft cats for survey, and write SOPs that read like field medicine. Stabilize, move, fix later. All of it rolls downhill to the wells. Fields that sat comfortably inside the logistics envelope nudge the edge. If transport adds $3 a barrel, the marginal prospect slips red. Maintenance that depended on 2-week lake windows now compresses into 5 days with 3 good mornings. A crane barge stuck on a shoal means a compressor stays offline and a plateau dips. This was the moment everything changed, not a storm but a spreadsheet. The Caspian's decline rate, about 7 centimeters a year, turned ports into projects and voyages into negotiations. While docks scrape bottom, something else is sinking too. Under the rigs and routes, the seabed itself is moving. Subsidence, pipelines, and the hidden collapse. While docks scrape bottom, the seabed sags. You don't see it from a helidoc. You feel it in gauges and in pipe that doesn't sit where it used to. Mature reservoirs across the North Caspian have been bled for decades. Pull fluids out of rock, the rock compacts. A few millimeters a year under platform, a few centimeters along a trunk line laid on sediment that behaves like memory foam with a slow leak. Add falling water above, less buoyancy, more effective weight on every span, and a silent geometry shifts. Reservoir engineers track compaction on logs and level shots. Offshore supervisors track it when a walkway that once met a boat at mid-tide now meets it at shoulder height, with no tide to blame. Around Kashagan and Filanovsky, the fix looked like steel, piles driven deeper, jacks to keep decks true. Underwater, the fixes are uglier. Pipelines designed for partial support lose it as mud slumps away. A sag bend appears between supports that were once enough. Stretch concentrates, coatings crack. Corrosion starts where cathodic protection didn't plan for air. Shallow water means pipes are close to waves. When levels drop, wave base bites deeper relative to the line. Storms you used to ignore now push oscillatory loads into spans that didn't exist last year. Meanwhile, canals and approach channels, dredged deeper to nurse shipping, change local currents. Scour pits dig at pipe shoulders. In places where builders floated sections into place, the loss of buoyancy isn't theory. Negative freeboard in a canal becomes a buckle risk if a pressure swing meets a tired elbow. The inspection pig tells that story without poetry. A launch in autumn, a reception a day later, and a data file that shows a healthy oval cross-section turning into a flattened egg near KM 47. Ovalization means load. Load means risk. When the control room flags it, operators do what their contracts hate. They derate pressure and shut in sections to keep a defect from becoming a failure. Phones ring in ministries before the valves finish closing. Here's a micro moment. A pipeline controller on a night shift in Aral watches differential pressures drift outside comfort. The pig run was clean, but the trending is. He calls the field. A maintenance lead boots up a vibro monitor feed from a suspect span. The numbers twitch with a storm that started 6 hours north. They mark a slowdown. By morning, a minister's aide is asking why export receipts will miss target this week. Nobody mentions mud when they brief the headline. They say integrity. They say caution. Subsidence isn't uniform. A platform over compacting pocket can tilt a few millimeters. A buried lateral over stiffer clay won't. That mismatch creates kinks at tines, stress at flanges, and weird wear at supports. Repair seasons shrink as the lake grants fewer calm days. Divers lose hours to chop. ROVs fight silt plumes raised by their own thrusters because exposed flats feed dust to every wind. Each day lost in May becomes a September job that runs into ice prep. The stakes stack fast. The Caspian's export math is narrow. A lot of barrels ride on a handful of corridors. The CPC pipeline to Novorossiysk is the artery for Kazakhstan's crude. Shut it to weld a clamp near the shore and storage balloons inland. If you throttle an offshore trunk line that feeds it, the congestion starts earlier and spreads wider. Traders notice. They price risk into spreads. Caspian barrels sell at a discount not because the oil changed, but because the path did. Companies respond with steel and schedule. They add supports under free spans and grout bags to armor scoured shoulders. They reroute over microdeltas that didn't exist 10 years ago, chasing stable ground that won't stay stable. They derate lines in summer when wave energy bites. They pre-stage repair skids and composite wraps at ports where pilots still promise access on short notice. Capex spikes in columns nobody wanted to see grow. Integrity budgets swell. So do insurance questionnaires. Regulators watch and adjust windows. Environmental permits that once allowed a whole season of nearshore work narrow to protect spawning runs forced into fewer viable shallows as levels drop. That leaves contractors threading needles. Enough calm, enough daylight, enough permit hours, and a supply chain that delivers the right gasket on the right barge with a channel deep enough to float it. Miss one, wait a week. Meanwhile, inland canals change character. When water sits lower, the Volga and feeder channels lose the lift that kept heavy pipe strings buoyant during tow-outs. Builders who used to count on water to share the load now count axle weights on multi-wheels and the deflection of old bridges not designed for a pipe that won't float. A laid-on yard that was a barge ride to a spool base becomes a convoy with escorts and curfews. Market desks don't need the physics, they need predictability. Every unplanned derate throws a calendar, cargoes get renominated, blends change as operators lean on different fields to meet a spec. A cargo that was CPC blend last month tastes more like Tengiz this month. Refiners hedge, discounts creep, the reputation follows the barrel. What nobody planned for was the compounding. Falling water removes buoyancy, raises wave interaction, exposes lines to temperature swings, and complicates crew access. Compaction below quietly shifts supports and stresses. Dredging to fix shipping bites into seabeds that used to cradle pipe. Then a pig finds a shape that suggests fatigue. One detail would prove crucial later. Every fix assumes a map that holds still. Here, the map refuses. The engineering scramble sits on top of an older argument. What exactly is this water in the eyes of the law? Sea versus lake, the $10 trillion legal trap. Call it a sea and you think freedom of navigation, pipelines laid like nerves across a continental shelf. Call it a lake and you think literal rights, everything negotiated at the shoreline. The Caspian is neither officially. In 2018, after decades of arguments, the 5 littoral states signed a convention giving it special legal status. The seabed would be divided into national sectors. The surface would be shared. It sounded elegant. It turned out slippery, and it's exactly the gray zone Russia and Iran used to force environmental veto power over subsea pipelines. To understand why, follow a cable that never got laid. Turkmenistan's gas sits on one side. Azerbaijan's connection to Europe sits on the other. A short pipe across the middle could have fed the southern gas corridor. It didn't happen. On paper, the 2018 deal let coastal states agree to pipelines that crossed only their sectors with environmental safeguards. In practice, Russia and Iran raised those safeguards like a gate, wielding basin-wide impact claims to stall the Trans-Caspian idea. Environmental reviews became vetoes in everything but name. Meetings multiplied. Shovels stayed in warehouses. Meanwhile, where to draw the lines underwater became its own chessboard. Midline, modified equidistance, enclaves around projecting coasts. Each formula moved billions in reserves a few clicks one way or the other. Unitization, the oil industry's polite word for sharing a reservoir that straddles a border, needed trust and timing. Instead, surveys met suspicion. A well on one side looked like drainage from the other. Tempers stayed low, paperwork stayed high, and investors priced delay into every forecast. Here's a room you don't see on tour. A law firm in Baku, windows over the bay, spreads maps on a table, bathymetry, license blocks, a consultant's best guess at a carbonate rim. 2 clients stare at a thin blue line labeled proposed sector boundary. If it shifts 3 kilometers, a prospect lands outside their license. If it stays, their lender unfreezes the next tranche. The meeting isn't about geology anymore. It's about treaty grammar and how a comma in Russian versions compares to the Farsi and Kazakh texts. The surface being shared sounds benign until ships need rules. Who inspects? Who escorts? Who patrols? The 2018 convention sketched naval cooperation and left edges undefined. That ambiguity showed up as quiet incidents, patrol boats shadowing survey vessels, fishery enforcement bumping against oilfield security perimeters. Nothing dramatic, enough to make project managers carry two plans, one for weather, one for neighbors. Pipeline approval sat in the grayest zone of all. The letter said literal states whose sectors were crossed could approve with environmental certification. The spirit, as exercised by Moscow and Tehran, said the whole sea had a say. They argued currents don't respect lines on charts. A leak in the middle finds everyone's shore. Environmental concern did real work in memos, while geopolitics did the work in private. Meanwhile, European buyers courted Ashgabat for molecules they could count as diversification. Deals were signed around the obstacle. Swaps through Iran, compression tweaks east of the Caspian, talk of floating LNG that never penciled. Financing changed shape in that fog. Banks demanded political risk insurance priced for a map that might move. Legal opinions came with pages of caveats. Field unitization agreements stalled while lawyers debated reference points and datums. Liability for spills zigzagged between civil codes and sovereign immunities. Everyone agreed to arbitrate in neutral venues. Nobody wanted to be the first case. Onshore, the ambiguity bled into ports. If the surface is shared, can Azerbaijan extend a security cordon around Sangachal Bay that nudges into what Turkmen skippers consider open water? If a dredge plume drifts across an informal line, whose permit language governs, port masters solved it day by day, with radio calls, favors, and pilots who knew which uniform not to surprise. Back-channel swaps tried to thaw the gridlock. Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan floated joint development over disputed structures, worked the reservoir together, split the result, skipped the boundary fight. It looked sensible. Then someone asked who operated, under which safety rules, with which environmental standard when a winter blow spills diesel. The answer required trust stronger than the convention supplied. Talks cooled. The legal trap tightens because the water is leaving. As the shoreline retreats, the baseline used to draw sector limits can shift in practice, even if not in law. A dredged channel becomes a state's lifeline and therefore a point of leverage. A stranded offshore installation sits on what's effectively land, raising questions no negotiator thought to write down. Do maritime safety codes still apply if your platform is now a peninsula? Who owns the dirt that appeared? Russia and Iran play a longer game under the same rules. Russia leans on the Volga, about 80% of the Caspian's inflow, to shape both hydrology and politics. Iran leans on geography, its southern shore deeper and less exposed to desiccation, and on the north-south corridor that ties the sea to rail and road in a sanction-proof loop. Both cite ecology when subsea pipes threaten their leverage. Both offer swaps and partnerships when they don't. The price shows up where bankers live. Rising borrowing costs for anything that touches contested or contingent assets. Escrow requirements that lock cash to environmental performance benchmarks. Premiums for contractors willing to sign under two legal systems at once. Delay damages tied to approvals nobody controls. It's not melodrama, it's math. Meanwhile, a young engineer in Aral scrolls through PDFs of the 2018 convention on her laptop while her boss asks when the pigging will finish. She's not a lawyer, but her maintenance plan depends on a permit that depends on a boundary that depends on a meeting in a city she's never visited. The sea keeps retreating, the law keeps hedging. And a pipeline that could lower pressure on everyone stays theoretical, because the Caspian is what the signatures made it, something you can't quite name, holding 10 trillion in bets that need a word. Kashagan's lesson, megaprojects in a shrinking bowl. Kashagan was supposed to be untouchable, too big to fail, too expensive to question. A carbonate giant stitched under the North Caspian's skin, holding billions of barrels at pressures that make engineers speak softly. Then the water fell, and the project learned its bowl had a hole. Start with where it sits. 3 to 4 meters of water on a good day, ice 4 to 5 months, a year riverborne silt drifting like a slow fog, and more than $50 billion already sunk into making it work. The field solution was steel and distance. build artificial islands out on the flat, raise living quarters and manifolds above storm chop, and run sour fluids through metallurgy that doesn't forgive mistakes. More than $50 billion went into that bet. The first leaks years ago taught everyone what hydrogen sulfide does to pipe. Replacements came, production returned, but shallow never stopped being shallow. Winter wrote the calendar. Ice returns early, splintering into flows that twist around pilings. Summer rewrote the margins, hotter, dustier, shallower. Barges don't just slow, they stop, trapped in pressure ridges strong enough to shove an anchor sideways. Crews learned to read ice like a second language. Freeze up meant stockpiles had to be perfect. Miss a filter order in October and you ran out in January with a storm pinning helicopters on deck. Spring used to be the relief, thick ice thinning to a chocolate slush that barges could nose through. Lately, spring arrives earlier but weaker, with draft so thin that a misjudged wake plows silt. The decline runs near 7 centimeters a year. Every centimeter steals a day somewhere. The window shrank from both ends. Hovercraft became the patch. They skate over mud and ice and water alike, hauling crews to islands when hulls can't. They're loud, they're temperamental, and they don't carry compressors. For heavy lifts, modularization took over. Break everything into pieces a shallow draft barge or a winter conv can handle, then reassemble at sea on a platform that wants a still day you rarely get anymore. Every puzzle solved by modules adds joints, gaskets, and failure points that need maintenance you must schedule around whether you don't control. Hydrogen sulfide set the rules inside the pipe, everything from weld rod to elastomer's bode to sour service. Oxygen became both lifeline and constraint. Confined space entries on islands came with gas monitors that chirped like anxious birds. Maintenance schedules had to match water windows, those short runs of calm that let a crew transfer safely. Falling levels made those windows shorter and more precious. Navigation drafts tightened. A barge stuffed to plan sat an inch too deep and kissed bottom in a channel that had been dredged last month. The skipper lightened down, waited for wind set to lift the basin a hand's width, and a 10-hour job became a 30-hour dance. A winter micro-story stuck with people, a convoy of 2 barges with spools, a tug with a patient captain, and a forecast that promised a narrow lane. By dusk, ice stacked like broken plates and the lead barge froze in a new ridge. A second tug freed it at dawn, but the spools missed their maintenance slot. The contractor stayed on hire. The island crew pulled a workaround from a laminated binder, demurred a non-critical loop, and carried the risk to the next window. That's how costs crawl, not in headlines, but in nights like that. Meanwhile, the lake's retreat crept into everything. Soundings around artificial islands showed the seabed dropping relative to the decks, not because the platforms moved, but because water left and sediments shifted. The gap between designed sea state and lived sea state widened. Workboats earned ice-class retrofits to shove through shoulder seasons that used to be kinder. Survey cats with twin hulls took over patrols where deep V hulls once sufficed, skipping over chop that stacked too short and too mean. Even the air changed. Dust blew off new flats in heat waves, coating intakes and gumming filters meant for salt, not silt. Per barrel costs moved in quiet increments. More dredging for approach channels, more towage on standby for the what-if that happens twice a month, more pilotage hours as ports demanded escorts in water they no longer trusted. A compressor brought in for a planned outage waited on a crane barge that waited on a tug that waited on a wind that didn't behave. The outage stretched, gas re-injection lagged, and reservoir management nudged a notch from optimal to acceptable. Multiply that by quarters, and national budgets felt the weight. In a place where oil taxes pay for roads and salaries, a 10-day slip isn't a line item. It's a rumor in a ministry and a call to the operator. Kazakhstan's answer was predictable: more steel. Extend jetties, drop new piles, widen channels, buy amphibious kit, add redundancy. The project's answer was similar: thicker wraps on sour lines, more LDAR crews to hunt fugitive methane when logistics stress made maintenance ugly, electrify where possible to cut flaring that satellites can see. The math still argued for staying. The reservoir is real. The sunk capex is massive. The alternative is watching a decade of engineering strand on a mudflat. But under the confidence sat a new humility. Kashagan was built on the assumption that the bowl would wobble, not tip. Now draft lines on pilothouse windows feel like cliff edges. A young planner walks a whiteboard, ringing the days each month when weather, water, permits, and people align. There are fewer rings than last year. She adjusts crew shifts, swaps in a hovercraft for a crew boat, and slides a safety talk an hour earlier to beat a forecast squall. It looks like logistics. It feels like triage. When the sea retreats, companies add steel, states add leverage. The field keeps pumping, the bowl keeps shrinking, and every barrel carries a little more cost, a little more risk, and a quiet admission: the water was always part of the infrastructure. Now that it's leaving, Kashagan has to rebuild the lake as much as the field. Route wars: who controls the Caspian flow? Follow the barrel and you'll find the map arguing with itself. Kazakhstan's crude leaves fields that sit on a shrinking bowl and has to pick a door. West, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium line runs to Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, a Soviet-era corridor modernized into the main artery. South and west, a lattice of rail and sea moves oil to Baku, then on to Georgia's ports and the Mediterranean through the Baku to Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. Each path carries politics like static. CPC is the workhorse. It lifts more than two-thirds of Kazakhstan's exports and runs through Russia. On a calm month, it's invisible control rooms, pump stations, a marine terminal that swallows tankers and spits them out full. On a bad week, whether scrubs loadings or a maintenance window shaves capacity. Since sanctions tighten around Russia, every hiccup carries headlines and risk premia. Insurers rewrite clauses. Shippers file for waivers that take longer to land. A dent at a Black Sea berth becomes a policy call in a boardroom far from the Caspian. The alternative looks seductive on paper: move volumes to Baku across the inland sea, then feed BTC to Turkey's coast. It dodges Russian jurisdiction and rides infrastructure built for that very purpose. In practice, the Caspian sets the pace. Ferries that carry rail wagons and RORO decks that swallow trucks became the weak link even before levels fell. Now shallow approaches in Aktau and Kurik force light loads and missed windows. Tug skippers time departures to wind set, not schedules. A perfect chain, and there's no such thing anymore, still loses hours at each link. Here's a micro story from a dispatcher's desk in Atirau. She's juggling 3 modes for one cargo: rail to Kurik, ferry to Alat, and a pipeline slot into BTC. A late dredge cut leaves the ferry half-loaded to clear the bar. The ship misses its Alat window by 6 hours. The BTC slot doesn't wait. She calls a trader, reroutes part of the parcel to Batumi by rail with a discount that hurts, and pushes the rest into storage. The refinery in Ceyhan keeps its run, but pays a premium for flexibility. The delay becomes a spread on a screen. Routes south tempt with swaps. Iran's Necker terminal can take oil north, feed it into Iran's system, and deliver equivalent crude to the Gulf. It's elegant because molecules don't have to pass the bottleneck you're staring at, but swaps wear sanctions like a collar. Quiet waivers exist, they're not durable. A minister who signs one today might retract it next quarter when a headline flares somewhere else. Traders plan with one hand while keeping the other in their pocket. Astrakhan is the inland pinch no one markets. The Volga Delta once felt generous: multiple passes, broad channels. Low water turns those braids into a maze of shallow cuts. Draft drops and barge tows that used to glide now crawl or wait for a wind that lifts a decimeter. Russia controls those gauges. Hydropower upstream sets release schedules that don't answer to a Kazakh loading plan. That's leverage without speeches. Capacity auctions expose that leverage in a polite format. Slots on ferries, windows at terminals, priority lines on single-track rail. They look like logistics, they behave like politics. A shipper with the right passport or portfolio sees friction vanish. Another sees no space until next week. Everyone pays in differentials. Caspian barrels trade under Brent not just for sulfur or API, but for doubt. Will it arrive when the refinery needs it? Then there's the shadow door. Older tankers with unclear ownership slip between busy inspectors. Smaller coastal craft carry parcels that don't show up on glossy route maps. Inland seas make AIS silence feel less like a stunt and more like an option. Authorities know. Sometimes they let it breathe because every quiet cargo relieves a louder bottleneck. Sometimes they pounce to make a point. Fines get paid. Patterns resume. Rail keeps the region honest when water wobbles. Kazakhstan pushes double tracking and longer passing loops east to west. Georgia and Azerbaijan tweak customs to shave hours. Even so, hills, tunnels, and bridges don't bend to ambition. A derailment in a gorge can stop a week's worth of containers. Storms on the Black Sea can block the last hop. Add the fall in Caspian levels, and ports must do two things at once: dredge harder to keep ships moving and funnel more volume onto rails designed for fewer trains. Sanctions pressure doesn't turn off flows, it makes them inventive. Quiet waivers appear for third-party operators who can't be embarrassed. Labels change on bills of lading. Blends get adjusted. A refinery that swore off certain origins finds itself buying Mediterranean mix, with timing that matches an outage somewhere east. Everyone keeps a lawyer on speed dial. This was the moment everything changed for traders. Logistics became a trading strategy, not a cost center. Who controls the Caspian flow isn't just a flag or a pipe. It's a stack of permissions, pilots, pumps, and weather windows that prices every barrel twice, once for what it is, again for how it moves. And that stack is fragile on a good day. Climate volatility makes those good days rarer. Climate whiplash, evaporation, Volga, and the heat engine. To see why the water's leaving, you have to read the balance sheet. Inputs, rivers, rain, a little snow. Outputs, evaporation. The Caspian has no drain, only sky. 80% of what comes in rides the Volga. Lately, more leaves than arrives, and the line that matters is simple. The surface is dropping around 7 centimeters a year. Over 2 meters since the mid-200s. Not a bad decade, a new baseline. Up in the Volga basin, heat rewrites the calendar, and the Caspian pays the bill. Winters that used to bank snow now give rain that races off frozen ground. Spring pulses arrive earlier and thinner, missing the North shipping season by just enough to matter. Reservoirs from Rybinsk to Volgograd turn the river into a staircase of choices. Open gates to help navigation, and you shave kilowatts. Hold back for hydropower, and you starve the delta. Flood safety wins afternoons in June, but a shallow Astrakhan bar decides contracts in September. Managers call it multi-objective optimization. River towns call it low water. At Rybinsk, exposed shoals crack like old paint. At Nizhny Novgorod, ferry slips sit dry. Downstream, the delta braids that once spread wide have narrowed into guarded channels. A northerly blow can drop local levels 30 centimeters in hours, pushing salt tongues into places that used to taste fresh. Intakes cough. Villages drag pumps closer to what's left of the edge. Evaporation is the quiet thief. Longer ice-free seasons, warmer air, more water lost to sky. Warmer air holds more moisture. Longer ice-free seasons mean the lake can breathe water to the sky well into autumn. A still, warm October day that feels kind onshore acts like a vacuum over the surface, pulling centimeters you won't see until a captain reads the draft board and swears. The wind helps. Fetch across the open reaches stacks water south, then lets it slosh back north, a slow metronome that knocks port plans off beat. Here's where physics gets personal. In the north, depth is a rumor. Average water sits in the single digits of meters. Knock 7 centimeters a year off that, year after year, and you lose whole square kilometers to reeds and flats. Those new skins heat faster, throwing dust when drought rides the steppe. That dust lands on snow in the Volga headwaters, darkens it, and speeds the melt that already arrives too soon. A loop tightens. Storms don't fix it, they complicate it. Drought summers burn fields and shrink tributaries to threads. Then a blocked pattern breaks and dumps a month of rain in 3 days. Reservoirs lurch from caution to emergency discharge. The pulse roars past the people who needed a steady trickle in May and pours into the delta when yards are stacked with gear for a calm season that never arrives. The sea gets a spike, not a refill. By November, evaporation takes back the bonus with interest. The Volga is a man-made cascade now, and every choice upstream echoes in the Caspian's shallows. Hydropower plants chase evening peaks on the grid, meeting cities, air conditioners in July with water that downstream ports would rather keep for September draft. Navigation windows on the river grow fickle. Barges carry less. Tow speeds drop. The savings account at the end of the system. The sea sees only the leftovers. Meanwhile, the Kura and Ural bring their own thin gifts, stressed by irrigation upstream and hotter summers that sip more as water crosses floodplains. Precipitation over the Caspian itself helps, but not enough. A stray wet year teases a rebound that doesn't hold. The long trend runs down. Ports that counted on spring top-ups now count contingency days instead. A micro-story in a delta village makes the math human. A fisherman keeps a stick by his shed, notched with past springs. The 199s sit a hand higher. The 200s a finger. This year, the river never reached the notch that meant safe to set nets in Channel 2. He moved gear twice, watched salt creep up reeds that used to be fresh, and took a day job hauling gravel because the river that raised him keeps changing its mind. The lake's own heat engine plays a longer role. Bare water warms earlier. It breathes heat into the lower atmosphere, tugging wind and shaping local storms. Darker exposed flats feed convection, but there's less surface to trade with the sky each year, and what's left sits warmer. That means stronger late-season evaporation and sharper thermal contrasts that make wind set more violent. The system isn't just shrinking, it's getting twitchy. Upstream, reservoir operators face bad choices in good faith. Release more for ecology and navigation, and you sacrifice megawatt-hours. A grid now counts as clean. Hold for hydropower, and you turn the Caspian's north into a maintenance problem and a health story. Neither path fixes heat. Both borrow from someone else's column. This was the moment everything changed for planners. The Caspian stopped acting like a lake with a long memory and started behaving like a basin on fast forward. Declines near 7 centimeters a year don't read as headlines. They read as drafts, permits, and missed weeks. What leaves as vapor returns as storms in the wrong place at the wrong time. And every centimeter missing in spring costs a fortune by fall. Toxic flats, salinization, dust storms, and public health. When water leaves, the seabed doesn't. It waits. In the north, where depth used to measure in single meters, the retreat exposed a patchwork of clay, salt crusts, and sediments that remember every spill, every pipe, every runoff plume from a river mouth. Under a summer sun, those flats harden into plates. Under a dry wind, they lift. Aral Sea Syndrome is the shorthand the doctors use when they're being candid. It means salt dust storms that ride low and abrasive, carrying fine particles laced with whatever history saved, hydrocarbons from leaks, metals from old industry, nutrients that feed the wrong blooms in the wrong places. It means a clinic in Manchester where the intake spikes on days the wind turns east. Here's a morning there. A nurse unlocks at 7:45. By 8:20, kids with coughs crowd the chairs, eyes red, throats raw, asthma inhalers empty. Their parents talk in the hallway about yesterday's gusts, 2 dogs lost along the edge of new flats, and a field that used to be a shoreline. The doctor doesn't say dust. He says rest, fluids, refill, but he writes the date on a clipboard where he keeps a private tally next to a column labeled wind. Dust isn't the only insult. As the shoreline retreats, salinity creeps. Shallow lagoons pinch off from the main body, evaporate, and concentrate salts. Wells close to the coast turn brackish. Villages that once pumped sweet water from shallow aquifers find their taps tasting like tears. Tanker trucks show up twice a week instead of once. The price doubles on off days. Fishing collapses quietly first. Inlets that hatched fry turn to warm ponds with a salt line that shifts daily. Nets haul weed from channels that used to carry current. Small boats park on mud and wait for a blow that will never lift enough water to launch them again. In the markets, sturgeon is memory. Caspian seal haulouts, once tucked on offshore bars, sit too close to people and dogs. Disturbance rises, pups fail, and a species already in trouble sinks lower. Onshore industry meets its past. Exposed sediments near old loading points glitter with the film you only see if you've worked a terminal at night. The oil isn't fresh, it's persistent. When a dust devil scoops that top millimeter, it doesn't just move soil, it moves a chemical record into lungs. Soil tests upstream of the flats repeat a theme. Legacy loads wake up when wind returns. Companies try to get ahead of it. Shelter belts, belts of hardy shrubs and trees, go in along the new edge, the leaves meant to rough the wind and pin dust. Wetting programs spray problem zones before forecast gusts. Restricted zones grow on maps, closing new flats to foot traffic and off-roaders who carve paths that the wind turns into channels. It helps at the margins. It doesn't change the physics. A foreman at a yard outside Akto runs a different ledger. He tracks lost time incidents, sure. He also tracks dust days when crews work under masks and eyes sting by noon. Productivity dips. Insurance premiums ask new questions about respiratory PPE and air monitoring. An access road to a project catches a protest one Friday, residents angry about a week of grit in their kitchens and the way trucks kick the new shore into the air. Work stops for a day. Security adjusts routes. The dust keeps moving. Microstories stack. A teacher in Fort Shevchenko moves recess indoors for the 7th day this month, then wipes a fine film off the desks before math. A woman in a village near the Ural Delta tapes towels around window frames before a wind event the radio flagged at dawn, then fills buckets from a tanker she can't afford to miss. A port stevedore swaps goggles twice and still blinks grit from under the seal as he guides a lift under sky that looks clean until you stare long. Ecology bends under the same load. Reed beds race across new mud, trapping more dust near shore but pushing the fresh salt line into odd pockets that fish can't use. Bird counts shift as shallow feeding grounds vanish by summer. Conservation maps drawn a decade ago lose their anchors. Protected areas find themselves marooned from the habitats they were meant to guard. Policymakers reach for programs that sound like control. Plant more, spray more, close access, enforce, all necessary, none sufficient without water, because the flats aren't a problem to be managed, they're a symptom. The dust rises when the sea leaves. The salt creeps when inflow fails. The clinic fills when wind meets memory on exposed ground. In the end, the human ledger is plain. Lungs pay first, then budgets, then trust. A father watches his son's breathing settle at midnight after a nebulizer treatment and thinks about his own childhood afternoons by a shoreline that isn't there. He doesn't need a report to tell him what matters. He needs fewer dust days. He needs water closer than a truck. He needs wind that blows over waves, not over a map of old mistakes turned into air. The middle corridor, rails over water. Industry's answer to fickle water was simple on a whiteboard: go around it. The Trans-Caspian International Transport Route, TITR, the middle corridor, stitches China to Europe by rail, a ferry hop across the Caspian, more rail through the Caucasus, then Black Sea or Turkey to markets. Steel over water, schedules over waves. It works, until the lake reminds planners it still holds the hinge. Start in a dispatcher's booth at Dostik. Containers roll west, double-stacked with customs sealed in milliseconds by scanners. Schedules look clean. The problem sits 2,000 kilometers ahead, where sea meets rail at Aktow and Kurik. Approach channels cut by dredgers by a season. Falling levels steal it back. So trains bunch on sidings, while port masters squeeze ROROs into drafts that make captains check their pulses. Ferries are the corridor's softest rib. On a calm day, they're tidy machines, roll on, lash down, cross, roll off. At a headwind over a shrinking basin and drafts sit wrong. A master trims ballast for an extra 10 centimeters, declares underdeck cargo secure, and still waves off 2 trucks to clear the bar. Those tractors idle on the pier, drivers on per diem, dispatchers rebooking slots they begged for last month. Kazakhstan threw iron at the hinge. Kurik added ramps. Aktow deepened turning basins. A cutter suction dredger gnawed a channel through hardpan that felt like stone under mud. Crews in hard hats posed for ribbon cuttings. Then a northerly pushed water out of the bay and the ferry's light loaded again. A port engineer rubbed dust from a gauge and called for another cut. The dredge captain shrugged and swung the ladder back into the same channel. Meanwhile, rail tried to outrun water. Double-tracking projects near Bainu shaved minutes that add up to hours across a week. Passing loops lengthened. Wables went digital to peel customs time off at borders where paper once paused trains for days. It helps, but rails aren't magic. A derailment in a Kazakh steppe cut knocks a day out of a chain that can't spare one. A rain cell unloads over a Georgian gorge and a landslide rakes ballast into the river. The maintenance crew arrives with excavators and a prayer the next storm misses. Microstory, a forwarder in Almaty sold a client on TITR over the northern route. Faster, cleaner, fewer headlines. The cargo, a set of turbines too wide for trucks, too urgent for a ship around Suez, rolled smooth to Kurik, then met a ferry trimmed to clear a new shoal. The captain took half the conv. The rest waited 8 hours for wind to shift and the basin to rise enough to kiss the ramp. By the time they rolled into Alat, the customs window that harmonization promised had closed for a lunch break that wasn't on any app. The forwarder called, apologized, and offered a discount that ate his margin. He kept selling the route the next day. He had to. Azerbaijan played its part. Alat sprawled on new ground south of Baku, built to swallow ferries and feed trains toward Georgia. Cranes walked containers like metronomes. Customs desks went glass and digital. Even so, Black Sea weather sits at the far end of the chain with its own calendar. Batumi and Poti can stack ships when a squall parks offshore. A perfect TITR run can still miss a vessel by 2 hours and by 3 days of idle time. Europe's bet made the corridor a policy line. Sanctions on Russia turned shippers into students of geography. Volumes jumped. Headlines called it a renaissance. Then the hidden ceiling showed. Vessel shortages on the Caspian, rosters of tug crews burned by overtime, and quays that weren't wired for this many reefer plugs or this many trucks at dawn. Investors noticed the gap between slides and steel, and they priced it in. World Bank diagnostics circled ports and maritime as the weakest link. OECD reports named Akto and Kurik bottlenecks and flagged vessel deficits like a neon sign. Kazakhstan published timelines. Azerbaijan tightened its handshakes at border posts. Georgia hustled track work. The fixes are real. The water is faster. Here's the math at the pier. A ferry designed for a draft of 4.5 meters loads to 4.1 because the approach reads skinny. That's 6 trailers left behind. Multiply by rotations through a windy week and you lose dozens. Each payload left on concrete ripples backward. A factory in Cockley waits for parts. A site crew in Constanta burns a day rating anchors. A retailer in Krakow pushes a sail. The corridor isn't a failure. It's a bridge draped over moving water. Every improvement, double-tracked rail, harmonized customs, dredged cuts, new ferries, buys resilience. Every centimeter the lake surrenders taxes it. So dispatchers build slack into perfection, forwarders brief clients on wind set, and port captains keep one eye on an anemometer and one on a ledger. Energy flows still lag because bulk hates friction. Containers can wait a shift, crude can't. And until the hinge, the Caspian crossing, finds depth you can count on, rails over water will keep racing a shoreline that refuses to hold still. Gas chess, Trans-Caspian dreams, and Turkmenistan's hand. While containers played hopscotch across the middle corridor, another idea kept circling boardrooms. Forget ferries, move molecules. A pipe on the seabed from Turkmenistan to Azerbaijan, 200-odd kilometers across the middle, tie it into the southern gas corridor and send Central Asian gas to Europe without asking Moscow's permission or Tehran's patience. On a map, it's a short line. In practice, it's chess. Start in Ashgabat's quiet leverage. Turkmenistan sits on some of the world's largest gas reserves, most of it stranded east and south. Long-term contracts pipe volumes to China. Smaller flows move to Iran, with periodic spats over price and arrears. Europe waves from the far side of the Caspian, with buyers hungry for non-Russian gas. The Trans-Caspian gas pipeline has been floated, shelved, and floated again for 2 decades. Each revival runs into the same wall dressed in 2 costumes: law and environment. The law we've met. The 2018 convention says seabed sectors belong to littoral states. Pipelines crossing only those sectors can be agreed by them, with environmental assurances. Russia and Iran read that as everyone gets a say. They argue currents and risk ignore sector lines. A leak wouldn't ask for a passport before riding wind and wave. Environmental concern becomes the lever. Meetings multiply, nothing breaks. Meanwhile, the environment isn't a prop. The Caspian sits shallow in the north, deeper in the south, with sensitive habitats and a seal population already stressed by shrinking ice and shifting food. Survey vessels mapping routes kick up silt near deltas. Piling barges need drafts nobody can guarantee in 5 years. A pipe meant to future-proof Europe risks landing in a sea that is physically retreating. Financiers see that sentence even before lawyers add caveats. Turkmenistan plays its hand with patience and options. If Europe wants molecules now, swaps exist. Iran's Neckar terminal takes gas north, feeds Iran's grid, and frees up equivalent volumes for delivery south. Paper shuffles do the rest. It avoids a seabed fight. It also ties the deal to sanctions cycles and Tehran's internal needs. Reliability becomes a question mark, and buyers in Brussels dislike punctuation in winter. So Ashgabat courts across the water. Azerbaijan hosts. Baku knows the value of being a hub. The Southern Gas Corridor, South Caucasus Pipeline, TANAP across Turkey, tap into Europe, has room to expand with compressors and twin stretches. Slot Turkmen gas in, and the promise sells itself. But slotting isn't free. Compression adds capex and emissions unless you electrify. Existing upstream contracts and profiles dictate timing. Every molecule committed to one buyer is a molecule not sold into a different price spike. Here's a room in Baku where optimism meets arithmetic. An executive from SOCAR lays out capacity curves. A Turkmen delegate slides a folder across the table. Volumes ramp up, a price floor that won't insult domestic politics. An EU rep opens a notebook with targets circled in red. Everyone nods. Then a lawyer clears her throat and reads the clause about pipeline approvals under the 2018 convention. The room exhales. Someone floats interconnectors only in national sectors as a workaround. Someone else mutters cumulative impact assessment. Coffee arrives. The folder stays on the table. Back in Europe, politicians sell diversification to voters who watched bills double. Every non-Russian cubic meter looks like policy working. Brussels signs MOAS, pledges cash for feasibility studies, and hints at guarantees. The studies arrive with maps of trenches and landfalls, lists of seal haulouts, and a reminder that the northern Caspian's depth near future shorelines could make pipelay windows shorter and more expensive every year. The word adaptive shows up too often. Bankers hear risk. Russia and Iran don't slam doors, they wait hinges. Russia points to its own pipes and offers discounts that grow with geopolitics. Iran offers swaps and north-south logistics that thread sanctions with plausible deniability. Both emphasize ecology when asked about seabed steel. Both privately warn about security incidents nobody wants in a semi-enclosed sea. Turkmenistan hedges in kilns and torches. Flaring, already on the wrong side of satellite images, gets attention as Ashgabat courts European ESG screens. LDAR teams hunt leaks. Plans to cut methane emissions move from press releases into procurement lists. It's not only climate, it's contract math. European buyers are starting to price carbon intensity. A cubic meter from a cleaner system is worth more than one wrapped in fugitives and flares. Microstory: a consultant hired by a European utility flies to Turkmenbashi, rides a bus past rusted derricks to a plant where compressors thump under sun. He takes notes on valves, asks about spare parts, and scribbles a question about power supply, diesel or grid. He wants to know how a pipe, if it ever comes, will feed molecules that don't carry penalties on arrival. In the evening, he watches the horizon haze with dust from flats and thinks about a seabed where a pipe might lie. He underlines seasonal windows twice. Workarounds keep the dream alive. Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan float joint development over disputed structures again, this time with clearer operatorship split. EU officials talk up modular compression to squeeze more through existing corridors fast. Engineers draft designs for shorter interconnectors that splice Turkmen wells to Azerbaijani gathering systems without crossing contested lines. It all adds up to something less than a full Trans-Caspian, more than a shrug. Then winter in Europe nudges the needle. Storage sits comfortable after a mild season. Prices soften. Political urgency drops a notch. Back across the Caspian, the lake drops another few centimeters. A dredge in a lat cuts deeper. A turquoise seal lifts its head on a bar too close to a new shoreline. The window for quiet construction narrows another week. Gas chess isn't a stalemate. It's a long opening where tempo matters. Every season without seabed steel pushes Europe toward efficiency and LNG, and Turkmenistan toward swaps east and south. Every centimeter, the Caspian surrenders raises costs on the very project meant to future-proof flows. The pivot is coming. It just may not look like the straight line on the earliest maps. Methane flaring and the carbon cost of retreat. The lake's retreat doesn't just move steel, it moves numbers in the sky. Methane shows up first, silent, fast, and expensive in a world that now prices carbon and punishes leaks. Aging lines flex more as water drops and weather windows shrink. Gaskets that should have been swapped in May wait until September. A valve that tolerated one summer vibration faces two. What slips past is invisible on deck and obvious from orbit. Satellites don't argue. They log bright flares and strange plumes over the North Caspian on windless nights when a facility chooses heat over pressure swings it can't staff to fix. An orbital pass tags a column. A regulator's inbox pings. A trader updates a file that now matters more than sulfur specs, carbon intensity per barrel. A refinery in Europe adds a quiet surcharge when a supplier's methane number rises. The barrel didn't thicken, the market did. Here's the pinch on the ground. Maintenance crews that once moved by crew boat now switch to hovercraft and helicopters. Both cost more per hour. Both cap the number of tools a team can carry. LDAR leak detection and repair becomes a chess match with fewer turns. You can't chase every hiss. You pick the likely offenders. High-bleed pneumatics at island manifolds, compressor seals in temporary service, valves that sat half open during a stormy week. You're good, you still miss some. Flaring used to be framed as safety or startup noise. Now it's a signal. Each torch is a barcode for wasted gas, raw methane avoided but code 2 created. In a logistics crunch, operators flare to keep process stable when re-injection stumbles. A compressor late by a week becomes an extra night of light over a flat that used to be sea. Satellites catch the cadence. Reporters stitch maps. Buyers compare heat to promises. Electrification shows up as a fix you can measure. Swap diesel-driven pumps for electric. Replace instrument gas with compressed air or electric actuators. Tie islands to shore power where cable routes allow. It sounds simple until you lay it on a shrinking bowl. Subsea cables need burial in channels that silt. Nearshore cable landfalls need batters that ports already fight to keep open. A trench dug in July slumps by October. A transformer arrives on a barge trimmed to scrape through a cut that reads a decimeter shy. Microstory, a maintenance lead runs an LDAR crew out to an artificial island with a bag of IR cameras and a wind forecast that promises 4 hours of calm. They tag 3 leakers, 2 get fixed. The third sits behind a flange that needs a lift they can't stage before CHOP returns. He logs it, schedules the work, and stares at a flare that shouldn't be on. Back at base, he writes a note for the emissions report and adds a line item for a spare actuator the supplier says is on backorder for 3 weeks. The flare goes out the next day. The satellite won't see the nuance. Policy tightens while water thins. The EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism puts a quiet tax on carbon-heavy imports. Methane performance standards ask for proof, not plans. A Caspian barrel that arrives with a better methane story keeps its slot. One that doesn't seize its discount widen. Banks mirror the pressure. Sustainability-linked loans tie rates to emissions curves. Miss a target and your interest bill rises. Operators don't need activism to act. They need math. So they build programs with teeth. Quarterly LDAR with third-party audits. Permanent monitors on high-risk equipment. Vapor recovery units on tanks that used to breathe raw gas. Sour gas re-injection tuned tighter to avoid pressure spikes that force flares. Electrify what you can, fuel switch what you can't. Back at procurement, every spec adds the phrase low bleed, zero bleed, or electric. A decade ago, that sounded like PR. Now it sounds like access. Winners and losers sort by friction. A platform with shore power and electric drives runs quieter on the methane ledger. A field that relies on diesel compressors and long maintenance marathons slips. A country that publishes real-time emissions and takes the hit early finds customers who value honesty. One that treats leaks as paperwork meets a spreadsheet with a penalty column. Dust and heat make it harder. Filters clog faster on monitors. Calibrations drift in temperatures that push beyond manufacturer certs. Crews wear more PPE on dust days. You can't sniff leaks through a respirator. You need instruments that don't mind grit. Supply chains that once shipped seals in a week now quote a month. Every delay is a little methane. The carbon cost of retreat is not just physics. It's a new market writing a margin line. The Caspian can keep selling. It just has to show the work. Fewer flares in shoulder seasons, fewer plumes on still nights, more electrons in places that used to burn diesel. In a basin where every centimeter lost makes steel sweat, the cleanest barrel carries an invisible cushion, a better number that buys time when drafts and calendars won't. 5 shores, 5 agendas, the fragile peace. While pipelines flex and ports dredge, politics trims the sails. 5 shores look at the same falling water and see 5 different ledgers, 5 clocks, 5 red lines. From the north, Russia holds the tap and the toolkit. The Volga staircase, dams, reservoirs, locks feeds 80% of the Caspian's water and half its leverage. Astrakhan's shipyards refit river craft and shallow draft workboats, the kind a shrinking sea demands. Sanctions tightened Moscow's world, so the Caspian turned inward. shipbuilding contracts stay local, naval patrols knit tighter patterns, and the north-south corridor through Dagestan and Astrakhan becomes a policy spine. When levels drop, releases tilt toward grid needs upstream. Navigation windows on the Volga shrink, and that's a quiet reminder: hydrology is policy. Patrol boats show up where survey lines graze ambiguity. No fuss, just presence. Russia's oil from Filanovsky and neighbors sits in the same bowl as Kashagan. Shallow water threatens everyone's kit. But control of river timing puts one thumb on the scale. South Iran works around walls it's lived with for decades. The Caspian ports, Anzali, Amirabad, Nekka, tie into roads and rails that don't ask permission from the west. Swaps flow like policy jiu-jitsu, take crude north, deliver equivalent south. The international north-south transport corridor stitches Russian grain and timber through Iran to the Gulf and India. Every train that rolls makes sanctions a little less sharp. As water slips, Iran's deeper southern shelf looks more durable than the north's flats. Tehran uses that to stress environment in every subsea pipe conversation. It isn't only tactic, seals and fisheries matter, but it's leverage too. Patrol incidents stay small, legal notes stay pointed. The message is simple: if molecules want to cross the middle, they'll meet more than engineering. To the east, Kazakhstan balances budget math against bathymetry. Oil pays salaries, builds roads, and anchors politics. Aktau and Kurik define the country's hinge to the world. Both are at war with depth. Emergency dredging gets funded even when other lines don't. KTZ pushes double tracks because rail is the only real relief when ferries light load. Atirau counts on Kashagan's plateau. Every weather slip becomes a briefing. Diversification lives on slides, green hydrogen, battery metals, the middle corridor's promise, but today's payroll comes from barrels that depend on a lake that's leaving. Astana needs friends who can move cargo without Russian signatures and needs calm with Moscow because CPC remains the artery. It buys hovercraft and dredgers and patience and hopes the law cooperates more than it has. On the western shore, Azerbaijan sits at the junction and acts like it. Baku has turned geography into business for a century. Sangachal proves it in steel. With the Caspian shallowing, Alat's role grows: more ferries, faster cranes, customs that move data instead of paper. BTC and TAP make Baku a gate to Europe. That brings attention and friction. Navy patrols shadow survey vessels near disputed lines. Air overflights pair with invites to conferences that keep neighbors talking. Legal ambiguity over pipelines works for Baku when it slows rivals and against it when it slows partners. So Azerbaijan plays both clock and compass, selling reliability while its pilots read the same draft boards everybody else does. A maritime posture that looks confident from shore still checks wind, set every hour. Across the east again, Turkmenistan holds gas like a chess piece and whispers price. Ashgabat's isolation is performance and policy, tight borders, quiet deals, long memories. The dream of a Trans-Caspian interconnector hangs over every visit from Brussels. In the meantime, swaps through Iran and capacity tweaks east to China pay the bills. Each year, the sea creeps back from Turkmenbashi's berths, and the calculus gets uglier for pipes and lay barges. So the hand stays steady. Entertain joint development with Baku, bargain hard on volumes and terms, promise methane cuts to keep European doors ajar, and wait for someone else to blink on law. The fragile piece is maintenance, not a treaty. Patrol boats drift near fishermen who cross lines that moved with the water. A trawler captain swears he's always set nets there. An inspector points to a GPS and a map. Fines get paid. Boats go home. In winter, a Russian cutter and an Azeri patrol share tea over a disabled workboat dragged too close to a boundary. Quiet professionalism that rarely hits a headline. Fishing rights flare where livelihoods contract. Sturgeon bans are old. Enforcement is newer. Poachers move at night. Crews from 3 countries pretend not to see each other until a chase would embarrass someone. Seals beach too near villages, and kids with phones make the footage travel faster than ministries can. Militarization stays polite. New holes in old colors. Exercises announced with careful language. Radar on promontories that once held lighthouses. Ports that extend for commerce, acquire fences and cameras that read plates from far. Nothing overt. Enough to make risk managers add a line for security delay. Meanwhile, climate keeps erasing pretexts. When the river is low and the sea is lower, an incident needs no villain, just a gust and a bad chart. That uncertainty is the psychological tax everyone pays. That's what keeps underwriters awake and diplomats busy. The five shores don't need to love each other. They need the water between them to stay workable. For now, that's true on most days. The margin shrinks with every centimeter. Micro stories from the edge. Morning starts with weeds on the prop. Iskander leans over the stern of his skiff and cuts a mat of reeds from the propeller with a kitchen knife. The channel he's used since he was 20 sits ankle deep now, the water tea-brown and still. He sets the net where his father taught him, 3 arms spans off the old piling, then moves it twice because the current no longer tells him where the fish will ride. By noon, the sun bites. He hauls and finds 2 carp and a tangle of filament algae. On shore, he rinses his hands from a tank that tastes a little more like salt each week. When his son asks why they don't go farther out, he points at a strip of new land that wasn't there last spring and says, "We are out." At Akto, Samuel checks a schedule taped to a metal locker. Her shift slid to nights when the air hit 40 and the cranes stuttered in the afternoon. Nights used to mean reprieve. Now the heat lingers after dark and dust rides every breeze. She pulls on goggles, then swaps them for another pair when grit sneaks under the seal. A ferry idles in the basin because the draft board reads thin. The captain waits for wind set to lift the hull a hand's width. Samuel's overtime evaporates with the delay. She texts a friend on the rail side. If it floats, it's late. If it rolls, it waits. He replies with a photo of stacked boxes on a siding and a shrug emoji. Crosstown, Adil stands over a staff gauge bolted to a concrete pier and writes a number in a notebook he's been keeping for 4 years. He used to log once a week. This summer, his foreman asked for daily figures. The digits mean peril in a way only he sees. If the water sits below a threshold, barges trim cargo, pilots add escorts, and hours stretch without adding tonnage. Adil circles today's number and does the math. 2 shifts this weekend, not 3. He tells his crew before they climb into the launch. Half nod. One curses quietly and asks if the dredge is coming back. Adil says what he knows. When they find rock, it goes slow. Layla folds clothes into a plastic tub while her mother wraps glasses in newspaper. The house sits on an edge that used to be a bluff. Wind and waves ate the base during the high water years. Now the sea has retreated and left a cracked slope that slides when it rains. The relocation officer came twice, polite and practiced. Today the bus idles 2 streets over, headed to apartments near the new school. Layla's daughter asks if the old school will still have her friends. Layla says yes, and doesn't add the part about 2 bus rides and a bell that rings 5 minutes earlier than the driver ever arrives. On the ride, she checks a photo of the yard in spring, the one with water glinting through reeds. The window shows dust and a line of pilings walking toward land. On a platform out in the bowl, Yurgen pairs young welders with veterans. He counts minutes against weather calls and the way the hovercraft pilot checks the chop. A compressor that should have lifted out in May waits for a crane barge stuck on a shallow approach. He flips to a backup procedure, copies a checklist onto a whiteboard, and tells a crew to swap gaskets in a cramped corner where monitors chirp for H2S. The new hire nods and asks if the flare is supposed to be that bright. Today it is, Yurgen says, and adds a note to the maintenance log, tag for next calm window. By the clinic, Ada fans a child with a paper chart as dust lifts off the flats outside. The waiting room smells like antiseptic and sweat. She writes wind in the margin of 3 cases because the doctor asked her to keep count. Between patients, she steps outside and watches a truck kick grit off a road that used to end at water. She rinses her face from a bottle and thinks of her grandmother's stories about seals barking at night. Her phone buzzes with a message from her cousin in Baku, a video of cranes walking containers in clean arcs. She types back, "We sneeze when they breathe," then deletes it and sends a heart. None of them say hydrology or legal status. They say late, shallow, salty, dusty, moving. On maps, it's ports and pipelines. In rooms like these, it's nets that come up light, shifts that shift again, numbers that edge paychecks, kids asleep on buses, gaskets waiting on water, and lungs that notice the wind first. The price of holding the line. The shoreline keeps slipping, and everyone with skin in the game reaches for the same toolbox, Dredge, elevate, reroute, restore, regulate. The question isn't what to do, it's what to do first, and who pays when the bill shows up during a drought. Triage starts at the hinges. Ports decide which berths survive. Keep the ferry ramps that feed the middle corridor. Deepen the turning basins that keep bulk moving. Retire finger piers you can't keep wet without chewing rock all summer. A port director in Acto lays transparent math on a slide. Centimeters versus throughput. Hold depth at the main approach or lose a season's worth of rotations. That buys time for a price. Diesel for dredgers, overtime for pilots, and disruptions that ripple into rail. Elevation runs in parallel. Jetties grow higher. Causeways stack another course of rock. Warehouse floors lift on concrete ribs to dodge storm slosh and dust. It's not elegant. It's a decade of forklifts bumping over thresholds and operators swearing at ramps. But it keeps cargo dry and doors open when wind set drains the basin an extra hand's width. Reroute is rail, double tracks, longer loops, and dispatch rules that flex when a ferry light loads twice in a week. Customs harmonization jumps from communiques into code, single windows, pre-clearance, digital stamps that shave an hour at borders where paper stole days. It's unglamorous and decisive. Minutes stack into resilience. Restoration plays the quiet role that saves breath later. Deltas need room. Wetlands stitched like beads at river mouths strip phosphorus, settle sediment, and pin dust before it lifts. Reed beds can't replace meters of water, but they can tuck waves back into channels and take the edge off storms that now arrive, linger, and leave too fast. Upstream, floodplains that were narrowed for fields get reconnected where the math pencils. One farmer compensated, a village spared a flood, a plume thinned before it rides into the sea. Regulate is where tempers arrive. River compacts on paper turn water into appointments. Russia's Volga staircase already runs by chart. The ask is a different cadence. Release more in shoulder seasons to match navigation windows. Hold back less during peaking hours that pay the grid but starve the delta. That's a negotiation between megawatts and meters at Astrakhan. It takes money. Pay for flexibility with side deals, transmission upgrades, efficiency projects that cut evening spikes, and reserve capacity that means hydropower doesn't carry all of July. Finance threads through every bolt. CapEx sits on depletion curves and asks an unkind question. Will the field still justify this channel when today's wells plateau? Operators stage investments in steps. First a cut, then a second pass if production stays. Ports chase blended stacks. Sovereign funds for public works. Operator levies tied to tonnage. Climate programs for wetland chains that deliver both habitat and dust control. Everyone publishes to calm lenders. Meters on dredges, gauges at berths, satellite checks on dust. Transparency lowers interest, a notch you can hear in a ministry. Governance bends to clarity. Live dashboards replace rumor, yesterday's sea level, today's approach depth, next week's wind forecast, and the date the cutter dredger returns. Penalties and rewards stop being mysterious. If an intake exceeds a heat limit in August, allowable peaks drop next month. If a port hits draft targets 6 weeks straight, priority slots open for carriers who bring cleaner kit and publish emissions. Communities have to see their reflection in the fixes or they won't last. Lead the hardest work on the poorest blocks first. Water trucks scheduled and kept, wells tested and posted, masks at clinics when dust flags fly. Offer buyouts in flood and slide corridors that policy once insisted were safe. Write the checks clean, move the families once, wrap services around the relocation, and plant buffers where houses stood. That's not optics, it's consent. Industry tightens its own belt. LDAR goes quarterly with outside audits. Flaring plans meet wind, not wishes. Electrify pumps where cables can hold a trench and stage spares where they can't. Tie every new permit to return flow neutrality and real-time reporting the public can read without a legend. If a project drinks like a town, it owes the town miles of lead lines replaced and leaks found before it opens its gate. Agriculture upstream takes rules with receipts. Edge-of-field monitors pay farmers for measured cuts in phosphorus, not promises on paper. Two-stage ditches, controlled drainage, wetland chains, funded at speed, verified at the outlet. If storms erase gains, payouts hold because the meter said they tried. This is the boring path to survival. Stuff that works on time, under budget, repeated without speeches. The winners look dull: reliable ports, predictable drafts, emissions graphs that slope down, and communities that show up for public meetings because the last promise came true. Strip away the maps and it's simple. Hold the hinge, publish the numbers, fix the pipes, give the river room, and pay the people who live with the wind. There's no hero move. There's 1,000 moves that add up to water near the edge and silence in the clinic on dust days. You don't stop the bowl from shrinking, you stop it from stranding you. Vanishing Sea is redrawing borders and budgets in slow motion, turning contracts into weather reports and maps into moving targets. If you want to see where this story flows next, Arctic routes, Russian rivers, and Greenland's ice-flipping freight and fuel math, watch the video on your screen. Subscribe for more untold choke points and help us keep reporting the money, steel, and lives behind them. Your attention funds field work. Your voice pressures the people holding the line.